It's now official. Benjamin Netanyahu is out as Israeli prime minister. This was the moment a short time ago when 12 consecutive years as prime minister for Benjamin Netanyahu ended. A coalition of smaller parties joined forces against Netanyahu and, as expected, voted him out by a razor-thin margin on the streets of Jerusalem. There were late-night celebrations after the vote, ushering in the post-Netanyahu era. Supporters of the new incoming government have rallied in recent days with signs reading "Bye Bye Bibi," using the long-time, now former prime minister's nickname. And let's go straight to Jerusalem right now and CNN's Oren Lieberman. Oren, we couldn't keep you out of Jerusalem very long. This is definitely the end of an era, isn't it, with Netanyahu being out, but he's not going out quietly at this point.
Not at all. In Benjamin Netanyahu's last speech as prime minister just a few hours ago, he spoke obviously mostly in Hebrew, but he had one phrase in English. He said, "We'll be back soon," referring to his government. He lashed out at his rivals after listing his accomplishments. After more than 12 years in office and 3 years before that, he called the government that's replacing him a weak government, a dangerous government for Israel, and then said only he could stand up to the Biden administration when it comes to building in the settlements, when it comes to pushing back against a nuclear agreement with Iran. Then it was Naftali Bennett sworn in as Israel's new prime minister. He once worked for Netanyahu. He has now replaced him, promising a very different kind of politics, one of unity, one of agreement. He now leads the most diverse coalition in Israel's history, and he said he'll work to make that a government that works together to advance the interests of everyone in the country.
2 times in our history, we lost our Jewish home exactly because leaders of the previous generation refused to sit with one another. I am proud to sit with people with different opinions. At the decisive moment, we took responsibility. We took responsibility.
Shortly after the swearing in of Naftali Bennett as prime minister, he received a congratulatory statement from President Joe Biden. That statement reads, in part, "My administration is fully committed to working with the new Israeli government to advance security, stability, and peace for Israelis, Palestinians, and people throughout the broader region." The foreign minister of Israel, the new one that is, shortly thereafter received a congratulatory message from Secretary of State Blinken, and the defense minister here received another congratulatory message from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Those statements coming very soon after the swearing in of the new government. It was a government sworn in by a very thin margin, and that means it will be very difficult to govern, especially with Netanyahu as head of the opposition. And he promises to be a very active head of the opposition, making it difficult for Naftali Bennett as he tries to lead this country, a country that hasn't had a functioning government in quite some time. When it's worth looking at Netanyahu, it's worth considering that the end of this era of Netanyahu revolves around former President Donald Trump. And yet for all of the gifts, the political gifts that Trump gave Netanyahu, from moving the embassy, from recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, from the Golan Heights and the Abraham Accords, the one thing Trump never gave Netanyahu was an electoral victory. Netanyahu lasted just 144 days after the administration of President Donald Trump. He had a functioning government for exactly 0 of those days. Jim?
Quite an extraordinary transition and an historic night in Israel.
All right, let's bring in Aaron David Miller. He's a former Middle East peace negotiator, and he spent more than 2 decades working in the U.S. State Department under several presidents. Aaron, so good to see you. So in his final days, Netanyahu claimed election fraud and has vowed to take down Naftali, again, his former chief of staff. So how stable is this new coalition?
Well, the rhetoric sounds all too familiar, Fred. And there's, Netanyahu is not going away. He's going to go into the opposition. There won't be an Israeli Mar-a-Lago. He's going into the opposition. He will head the largest and most coherent political party in the country, Likud, and he will be plotting and pushing and pressing in an effort to embarrass this government at any chance he gets, and waiting eagerly to pick up the pieces if in fact it collapses.
So will he be a significant force against this coalition where I read this is what it's made up of, this unlikely coalition of parties from the right, center, left of Israeli spectrum, and for the first time, including an independent from an Arab party? That kind of diversity sounds strong, But you're saying
does.
possibly not up against a Netanyahu and opposition party.
Well, no. I think that there are several features of this government that actually may allow it to endure longer than the conventional analysis would suggest. First of all, there's mutually assured destruction, Israeli style. Both Bennett and Lapid, who will rotate, Bennett first as prime minister, and if you make it through 2 years plus, then Lapid will become prime minister. They have vetoes over major issues. Number two, all of these parties understand that the reason they're together now, bringing to an end a decade and more of Netanyahu's reign, is in large part because of him. And they are absolutely determined to keep him at bay. They also know that this is political oblivion for many of them if they don't make this government work. I mean, the prime minister, Fred, for the first time in the history of political history of Israel, has 6 seats. Usually, a prime minister represents one of the 2 major parties or a third party that has significant seats. Bennett has 6. So he's going to have to cooperate in order to survive.
And Bennett publicly thanked President Biden today for his support of Israel during the recent conflict in Gaza. Netanyahu's tone in his outgoing speech, well, let's say it was a little different. Listen.
Prime Minister in Israel must be able to say no to the President of the US in topics that are threats to our existence.
So is Biden the linchpin here?
Well, it's a big break for Biden. There's no doubt. And you'll notice it took him more than 3 weeks, better part of a month, after he became president in order to reach out to the former prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu, I think within hours. If I'm correct, of Naftali Bennett's government being sworn in, the president issued a statement congratulating him. Now, Biden knows he caught a break. He caught a break because Bennett is not going to play to the Republican base. He caught a break because Bennett is not going to play to the evangelicals. And he caught a break because I really think Bennett has no interest, or there's no margin for him in picking a fight with the United States. He's come across as very tough against the Iran nuclear agreement, but he will not do what Netanyahu did in order to undermine it. So Biden will have some breathing room, and it's a good thing. He's got a lot of headaches at home to manage.
So what kind of leadership do you see in a Prime Minister Bennett? Because already, I mean, it's publicly stated that he opposes a Palestinian state, believes Israel should annex much of the occupied West Bank.
Very little movement on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Fred. I mean, the issues are just too tough, the coalition way too diverse and too unwieldy. A lot of movement, and you referred to it in the opening, with respect to the Palestinian citizens of Israel. You now have, for the first time in the history, Israel's political history, a small, admittedly, Arab party formally participating in the government, when a month ago you had the worst communal violence between Israeli Jews and Arabs since the state was created. So that, I think, is very hopeful, and I think it's very good news. Second, the Israelis really do need to lower the temperature. They've been held hostage by a man who used elections in order to beat his convictions. He remains on trial, Mr. Netanyahu. So I think the temperature is going to go down, and I think this government will get to focus on issues regarding the economy, health, infrastructure. That sounds very familiar, too, in an effort to demonstrate that, in effect, there is not only life after Benjamin Netanyahu, there could be progress as well.
Add one more thing to the familiarity, transitions. We're learning that former Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu will not hold a traditional handover ceremony with the newly elected Prime Minister Bennett, but will hold a private meeting instead. What does that say to you?
Well, again, echoes of a situation.
A lot of familiarity going on here.
I mean, I voted for Republicans and Democrats and worked for them, but the reality is that Mr. Netanyahu cannot simply abide in defeat. To participate, he will see the new prime minister in a private meeting afterwards, but no rituals for this guy.
Aaron David Miller, always good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fred.